Om Drishyam Pratitam Pravilapayan San Matramanandaganam Vibhavayam Samahitam Sabahir Antaram Va Kalam Nyayetaha Sati Karma Bande Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. Brahman is a pure, indeterminable mass of pure conscious awareness, homogeneous and ever free. Therefore, taking what is outward and what is inward, render them into one indeterminable state. Then meditate upon that state, pass your time contentedly, and be free. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Aranmaye Parikoshe Virajan Brahmanishkalam Tachu Brahm Jyotisham Jyoti Tadyadatma Vidho Vidhu. Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. Shining like burnished gold, highest and deepest, the core intelligence of living beings, partless and indivisible, ever pure and free of all taint, the essence of everything, which all beings seek, either consciously or unconsciously. There shines Brahman. It is that which the Guru teaches. It is that which the wise ones exult in. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Sahana, Om Sahana Vavatu, Sahana Bhunaktu, Sahaviryam Karvavahai, Tejasvi Navaditamastu, Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman, the reality, protect us. May Brahman sustain us. May Brahman illumine our thinking consciousness. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, and with the Dharma teachings. And may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, and may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om. So in our 5th class, where we are concluding the teachings on Zen Buddhism, we have found it to be a very rich and deep tradition that's come to us from Mother India through 52 generations, through China and into Japan. And Buddhism, of course, also had its other rivers of ways it was flowing into Tibet and other countries. So we probably could do no better than to start off with Swami Vivekananda's quote, one of the quotes he had on Buddhism, when he says, "The 3 cycles of Buddhism were 500 years of the law, 500 years of images, and 500 years of tantras. You must not imagine that there ever was a religion in India called Buddhism, with temples and priests of its own order. Nothing of the sort. It was always within Hinduism. Only at one time the influence of Buddha was paramount, and this made the nation monastic." So we find out that Swamiji's observation of Buddhism was that inside of India it was never a separate religion. It was just part of the Sanatana Dharma, or part of what's affectionately known nowadays as Hinduism. And it had that monastic element in it, which means it was very non-dual and very much to the point of Lord Buddha's teachings with the 500 arhats that put together the Dhammapada at some point in time. We've taken some teachings from that, and I will also read some teachings from that today in regard to Buddha mind. So with that as our premise, we've embarked into these 5 classes, this being the 5th, on Zen Buddhism, and with the foundation remembering the Hinayana path, because part of the teachings here in this chart that we left off with last week had to do with explaining Hinayana and Mahayana to people. And our way of doing that is going to be based in the fact that Hinayana, or what was also called, maybe deceptively so, the lesser vehicle, and then how it grew into the greater vehicle. The lesser vehicle was not lesser in stature or lesser in profundity. It was only lesser in the fact that it didn't happen to include in it people of non-monastic vocation. And so it had almost had a short lifespan, a short shelf life religiously in the religious supermarket, and had to be saved by this greater vehicle that made Buddhism spread and imparted in such a way that people of the householder predilection, and even forest dwellers and people in other countries could, like King Ashoka and people who were running the nation that Buddhism flowed through, these different countries, could go to it and receive the teachings of Buddhism, which centered a lot around nonviolence, which is, of course, the very first yama, or practice of, or observance of yoga, which is, of course, Indian in its origin. So when you find a gentle incursion of Buddhism into other countries, you'll find it's always preceding by this desire to not do injury or harm to anyone, and to practice ahimsa, or nonviolence, in thought, word, and deed. All of these things were, of course, Indian in their origin and in their content. Very early on in India, they were that way. When Swamiji mentions 500 years of the Tantras, then you have to go back quite a long time, maybe even prior to the Vedacists coming into India, to find these tantric sadhakas and practitioners, worshippers of Shiva and Shakti, the masculine and feminine principle, in India along the Indus River Valley, very, very early times. They're calling that now the cradle of civilization because they're unearthing some images and statues and various icons that have to do with a period that even carbon dated, goes way earlier than they had originally thought. So the Tantrists contributed much to India, and then also eventually to Buddhism, as we see in Tibet Buddhism, which incepted a lot of tantric worship and images into it, which is a different strain of Buddhism. That was the earlier, lesser vehicle was very monastic and was very strict, and you had to renounce the world and become an arhat, and much like Lord Buddha did himself, living in the forest and meditating and going through this very ascetic period of his life until he sat under the bo tree and received his nirvana. Then you find that you have this whole different view of Buddhism, and also with its various streams of consciousness, you could say, or streams of intelligence, because that word Buddha or Buddhi means intelligence, and it's very key to all of what India is trying to teach us. That is, if you have a country, let's say if you have a philosophy like Tantra, it's proceeding pretty much along the Bhakti path, although Tantricism also wanted to look into all the wisdom teachings. You put Tantra together with yoga, and you put Tantra together with Buddhism, and you look at the Tantric and Vedic streams, the two rivers, mighty rivers that are flowing side by side, as I've often described it, and you'll find that Tantra really gives the heart to everything, and gives that practice of bhakti, and the devotional element to things, whereas otherwise it could become quite sterile and quite focused, as the lesser vehicle was having singular enlightenment, much like Zen Buddhism is focused on now. But as we've seen by some of the teachings I've presented in Zen Buddhism, that it wasn't just enlightenment that they were seeking, but that they had many practices, like the 3 pillars of Zen. We looked at that last week. And we looked in part at this chart, which we want to go on with and finish, to look at these, what's called in Japanese, jujukai. That is the 10 basic precepts of Buddhism, which are a part of Zen Buddhist teachings that you find, and been given a name even in Japanese. So my point about this whole beginning introduction or preamble is that we find that Buddhism was granted that heart with the Tantras, and that it became a greater vehicle and began to expand across many, many countries, so that you didn't have to be just a witness observer or just to reach a sort of high state of consciousness where you didn't have any truck with the world or any sort of lifetime with spouse and children and making a living and so forth. That there are many Buddhists that, of course, came across that and had different kinds of lifestyles. We looked at that in the first class when we looked at these 52 generations of Buddhism, and then the various Buddha Dharma successors, that some of them were married and some of them were monks and others were wanderers, and so that came down through many, many hands and many different walks of life. So then we take a look at that, and we see that Zen Buddhism might not be so sterile a tradition as you might be tempted to think of it when you hear it from the outside, when you just hear about it. Zen monasteries and temples and so forth were a part of it, but they had a very hands-on, warm way of welcoming you into the fold, and also finding your own consciousness, how important it was to in non-dual fashion, as we would say in Advaita Vedanta, take stock of and accept the fact that consciousness was pure and perfect in its inception, and that as it came down into the human mind and intelligence, buddhi, that it experienced these various divisions and separations, and you had to keep track of that. See, that's why I started out chanting Om Drishyam Pratitam Prabilapayan San, Anandaganam Vibhavayam, Samahitas Bahir Antaram Va. So Bahir means outer and Antaram means inner. So it seems like consciousness has been split into two, an outer and an inner, and people are seeking to master the outer and then somehow reach the inner through these tracks of introspection, contemplation. Zen means meditation, or Dhyan in yoga means meditation, or Chan in Chinese means meditation. So Dhyan, Chan, and Zen, these are all trying to awaken up the inner life. But then this poses a problem, because consciousness is ever one and indivisible, as this same chant evinces, that now all of a sudden you're thinking about two, outer and inner. And really, if you put that in terms of Advaita Vedanta, it's waking and dreaming. They're talking a lot about the Jagrat, the waking state, and Sushupti, Svapna, the dreaming state. And then, in order to make sense out of that two-ness, the outer and the inner, then you realize that there's a state called Sushupti, which transcends waking and dreaming, and it gets into a deep sleep kind of state, where consciousness is not aware of outer or inner. It's actually not aware of anything when it's not awakened yet. But when it becomes awakened, then it becomes aware that that deep sleep state is what it's been seeking all the time, and also where it came from. All the seeds for, if you want to put it in Samkhya Yoga terminology, then all the seeds for the manifestation came from that deep sleep state. They were held there, and then they came into the mind in its conception the mind field, and turned into manifested seeds called dreams or visions, manifestation or projection. And then after that they came to the waking state and turned into solid objects. Thoughts turned into solid objects. So you had this outward moving tendency of consciousness, but then the Lord Kapila of the Samkhya tradition wanted you to take it back in. There's a chain of evolutes going out, and then you have to then take them and follow them back in. And we know that's been done by sets of fives, because there's 5 elements and 5 senses and 5 subtle elements and 5-fold mind. And this is a quintuplication process, which I just put out a book about called Cosmic Quintuplications, or Panchakarana in Sanskrit. So these systems were well known at the time of Lord Buddha's life, which is about 550, that's 2 5s right there, 550 years before Jesus, before the Christian era. And so Buddhism did go through that monastic period and then spread out to a greater vehicle and began to spread out as it did into other countries. The main stream of that going to China and then to Japan, and another main tributary going to Tibet, as we know. The rivers that went to Burma and Laos and Vietnam were less pronounced, but nonetheless it spread there. And when it made this long march of some 52 generations that Lexicsen's talking about in his book called Living Buddha Zen, which we took up early in the class, the first class of this series, then you see that it reached Japan, and it has that same flavor of India's original Dharmic teachings, but begins to emphasize more on the non-dual. But if it reaches a new country, then it has to have basic precepts to follow, and people can't just jump to the high-minded nirvana or busho, it's called. You can't know their Buddha nature automatically because they have still this idea of outer and inner. Bahir antaram va. You have to take the outer and the inner and render them into one state, Shankara says. And then you have to meditate on that state and pass your time contentedly and be free. So the whole air or flavor of that kind of thinking and expressed through those kinds of slokas and sutras has to do with an original state that is non-dual to begin with, pure and perfect in its inception, actually before any thought of inception came along. And in that way, then you have the naturalness of Zen being expressed. Zen liked that idea, and by the time it had come through those 52 Dharma successors, that many generations and that much transmission of the teaching through these different countries, then it came to Zen in a very mature state. It had passed through many great minds, and so that way the purity of Zen is immediately impresses you when you hear about it. But there again, if it reaches a new country with Japanese people, and then when it finally comes from Japan to America, with American people, when it made that full cycle, in these Roshis that we saw in the last several generations, like Maezumi Roshi and Suzuki Roshi, we took his teachings on the 3 pillars of Zen, and other Roshis that came here, then it reaches people that haven't gotten grounded necessarily in the basic precepts of Buddhism. And so, I just heard today on the email, one of my friends just took up a Buddhist practice 3 months ago. So people are beginning to get into these practices and these religions, and it's new to them. And so then they're going to have to be aware of the precepts of Buddhism. Right away you'd think nonviolence, and that's what you would think also in yoga, if you took up the yoga practice. And we know that the father of yoga was very influenced by Lord Buddha. The father of yoga has had many incarnations, but the incarnation that we point out is the one as Patanjali, and he lived maybe 140 BC. So that's some 600-700 years after the Buddha had come and left the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path, and the 12 links, the Nidanas, and praticca samutpada, the idea of interdependent arising. Everything's connected to everything else. And that's the first thing you have to find out. And then you have to find out that this connection is also connecting your consciousness to nature. And that's not an ultimate good thing. In either yoga or Buddhism, you want to get beyond nature. Nature is a form-producing machine. And the highest flights of realization in both Advaita and Zen Buddhism are beyond form. So here's the problem, right? Here's where you're going to have to realize your formless nature, and this is a huge jump for most people. Most people can't manage a jump like that. Arjuna asks Sri Krishna about that in the Gita. Who is it that's more advanced, and what's the better path? Those who follow God with form, or those who follow the formless? And Krishna says, it's very hard to follow God the formless. It's very hard to reach that pinnacle. So most people will take this path of form. And it reminds us even in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa that he said bhakti is really the path for most people in this age. But none of those teachers ever said that that was the preferential path, that you should only go the way of bhakti. There are many souls who want to find their formless nature. And many of the teachings, both yoga and Vedanta plus Buddhism are, and actually if you look into Tantra too, are heading you towards this realization of the formless. As if nature will not quite cut it in the end. In fact, nature is where growth and birth and death and disease and illness and decay, these are teachings of the Buddha. This is where these things take place. They don't take place in your formless nature. So you weigh those two side by side with the Buddhist or Vedantic reasoning, and it begins to teach you or clear your mind about the fact that there's something about formlessness that's attracting me that I need to realize in this particular lifetime. It's here with me now in the form of Zen Buddhism, before that Chinese Buddhism, before that Indian Buddhism. And in India there was no Buddhism, as Vivekananda just said. So it's there from the very get-go in these Eastern philosophies, these Far Eastern philosophies. And it came to the Near East when it reached Japan. And it probably affected the Middle East along the way, you see, because you won't find as many Buddhists there in the Middle East as you find Muslims and Christians and Jews, but nevertheless Buddhism had its influence there too. It just probably, as I said, 550 years after Lord Buddha, Jesus came, and he was supposed to have gone east, so I'm sure he was aware of the teachings of Lord Buddha, as any great soul would be. What's going on in the world religiously is kind of what they're going to find out when they take form. So all of that has to do too with form and formlessness, and, or if you want to call it this, the outer and the inner, as I was just speaking. This is a nut you have to crack. It's a duality you have to crack. Now there are some dualities like pain and pleasure, and let's get over it. Happiness and sorrow, let's get over it. Virtue and vice, let's get over it. It's too moral. See, once we get it understood, let's go beyond those kinds of dualities, because they keep us down to a very basic level and they don't let the mind free. But when you start encountering dualities like, say, bondage and liberation, then it begins to speak to you about Zen Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, because they're saying there never was a time when the soul was ever bound in the first place. So you're having to entertain bondage and freedom in your mind. Am I really bound? Or what is it that's bound? And you would probably then make a move towards what is bound. It's my ego that's bound. It's my body that's bound to nature. It's my mind that's bound to dualities like pleasure and pain. And so you begin to account for everything that's the not-self. When you start listing down the characteristics of the not-self, you're beginning to head toward that break in philosophy called who am I, or I am. However way you want to put that. You're beginning to question, vichara, you're beginning to ask questions about your true nature. And you're going to have to come to conclusions, if you call it Buddha nature or you call it Atman, either one, you're going to have to come to these conclusions about what changes and what doesn't change, what's permanent and what's impermanent, or as Vedanta puts it, what's real and what's unreal. So these are all things that, since Lord Buddha knew about the Vedic period, and the Vedic period wasn't in a very healthy state when he was on earth, that these are all things that he knew about. Processes of reasoning and rationale, as well as the Bhakti Passive Tantra, were all in him, and he knew about them. So when he put together his Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path, and it had things in it like right orientation and right livelihood. I mean, those aren't high philosophical precepts, right? I mean, it's not, right livelihood is like, start making your money dharmically and quit making it adharmically. So when you find it reaching Japan, then it's got several important teachings about making money here in Zen Buddhism. See, how not to steal and how not to be preoccupied with wealth and all those things. So all of those are not necessarily, as I say, very high philosophical teachings. They're pretty basic tenets, jujikai. But there is an exoteric form of them that you, and then there's also an esoteric form of them that you must understand too. So the point being there, these higher dualities that you have to ponder. Bondage and liberation would be one, and form and formlessness would be another. Birth and death would be one along the way. Find out that the soul's described as birthless and deathless, so you'd want to ponder that and get to the root of that and begin to call death what it is, an illusion. Nothing dies because nothing was ever born in the first place. And you get these beautiful stotrams that sing that. Namritsorna Shanka Name Jati Beda Pita Naiva Me Naiva Mata Na Janmaha. And Chirananda Rupaha Shivoham Shivoham. Students sitting here in class today, we were just singing that yesterday. I was teaching it to him on the harmonium. So, Namrit Jorna Shanka. I have no death because I was never born. I have no birth and death in me. I have no father and I have no mother. Na pita, na mata. You see. My parents gave me my body. My soul is unborn, basically, you could say. See. So, I mean, there's not a lot of music in Buddhism. I've been asked actually by Dalai Lama and a few others during my musical career, because I knew I did spiritual music, to actually appear before Buddhist functions and sing music. And of course you'd have to sing music out of the Hindu fold, out of bhajans and stotrams. Especially stotrams are these, what I just sang you was called the Nirvana Shatkam. So it's one verse out of Shankara's non-dual stotram. So you'll search for Buddhist-like teachings and ways of expressing, because there's not a lot of music there. So, because it did remain very monastic in the beginning. It was very high-minded and didn't really come down to worship form, in pujas like Tantra does, or do practices like yoga does so much. See, it rather preferred to stay in this non-dual atmosphere and steep itself in that. Like Sri Ramakrishna said, just soak your mind in these high-minded teachings of the Dharma like you would dip a towel in water, in a lake until it's completely saturated. So that's the way that kind of non-dual philosophy would proceed and would spread in that way. So how to then, as we sang last week in one of these songs, please, O Ram, the devotee who's a bhakta, is asking. Cause my mind to quit perceiving duality everywhere. It's like he tried to get his mind to do that and he couldn't, so he's asking Ram, you just make my mind non-dual so I don't have to think about good and bad and pleasure and pain and life and death, virtue and vice and so forth. These are the dualities that Krishna calls dvandva mohena. He tells Arjuna, be careful of dvandva mohena. Mohena is moha, is delusion. Dvandva is duality. So these dualities that delude, you have to be careful of them in life. And we see if we look around life that people are caught in them. You see, that's their whole life is duality. In fact, not just duality. Duality then turns into diversity. You see, diversity then turns into scattered mind. And this is how Patanjali, 700 years after Buddha, would come along with the 5 states of mind and tell you about them based on teachings that were given previously in India. There's a scattered mind, there's a sick, dull mind, and there's a mind that's sometimes balanced and sometimes is restless, and those 3 aren't really fit to do yoga with, those 3 kinds of minds. But these other 2, you can have ekagra, which is one-pointed mind. Eka means one, and then you can have nirodha, no mind. So where did Patanjali get this no mind? You see, eventually you're hearing about Buddha mind and so forth, if it weren't from great rishis like that. And you could probably pretty much bet your chudder or your dhoti, whatever you're wearing, on the fact that Patanjali didn't consider Buddhism a separate religion from India, as Vivekananda was saying here. And I think I mentioned about 2 classes ago here that when I went to India and went to some of my Indian students' houses, and they wanted me to do a puja at their house, and I would sit down and do some worship, and there was a picture of Lord Buddha on the altar. And I'd say, oh, you have Buddhist leanings, and they would actually look at me and say, what's that? I'd say, what is Buddhism? You'd think, well, maybe that's a little naive, but it's the way they're thinking, that Buddha was an Indian rishi and there was never a separate religion for him. It's just that it's a practical matter. When Buddhism left India, then it had all these streams and it went to all these countries, and then you have China, Chan Zen, and then you have Japanese Zen, and then you have Tibetan Buddhism, and then you have different, Buddhist teachers who are teaching mindfulness out of Vietnam. Or something, you see, these far-flung places. So it's all one kind of Buddhism with different names, but it's really all traced back to India. So if you have these great high-minded teachings, but you still have practitioners that are cracking this nut of duality, dvandva mohena, these deluding pairs of opposites, as Krishna told Arjuna, then you do that through these basic precepts. We started into them last week, but let's look at it as if it were fresh this week. That is the quote from the Dhammapada, which is this lesser vehicle teaching. This is the original Buddhist text. The 500 arhats got together after Lord Buddha passed, and they all remembered what he said to them individually, and they all noted it down, and it turned into the Dhammapada. So this is like the fundamental Buddhist text, ancient text to study. From that, Lord Buddha was said to have stated this: the sincere practitioner should be watchful over his speech, well restrained in mind, and commit no unwholesome deed with the body. Let him thus purify this 3-fold avenue of karma and tread the path made known by the seers and sages. So Lord Buddha knew that there were seers and sages from the past and will come in the future too. Many Buddha emanations would come over these 52 generations. And he also knows that there was 3 ways in which karma was being formed by people. And if you kept your karma clean, along these 3 avenues, that you would be fine in life. And if not, then this is where the teachings of Praticca Samudpada, the interconnectedness of all things, would apply, because it's not just that oh, air connects to water, and water connects to fire, and fire connects to earth, and so forth. Those are connections you should just be aware of naturally. But it's that what you do in earth, air, fire, water, and ether with your body causes a karma, and those connections you're going to have to be aware of. If you don't use this physical body, its speech, and its actions in the right way in the 5 elements, then you have karmas repercussing in the 5 elements. So you get burnt, you can't breathe, no air, no fire, right? I mean, these 5 elements can kick back on you, and this is called karma. And it's actually karma at the very gross level, because in here, other karmas are happening. That's the inner, right? And those are frightful. The ones you suffer out here, they seem more frightful because you see people suffering physically, but the real problem is, the real karmas are in here, because this can cause more physical births, and that will have more, that will cause you to have more physical suffering. So the cause of the physical suffering in here is actually more frightful than what's happening to you outside. So, this is going to be a short first half, by the way, so that we can reset our equipment here. Evidently that has to happen today. That's the note I got this before class passed to me. And so in order to do that, we will just take a few of these right now in this way of speaking, according to these 3 avenues of karma. Keep those in mind. The Lord Buddha is saying you want to keep these pure, because without that you're not going to get to these high Zen teachings. You'll never understand them. You'll be on your way and you'll get sidetracked, or you'll get you'll have to encounter some of these karmas that are coming back at you. So you see how important it is to know the basic precepts in order to be able to keep the mind free and clear so that it can receive these higher teachings. People think they can just jump to them, like bottom step to top step, Sri Ramakrishna said, but you don't know what the middle steps contain, at that point, and how many karmas were hidden there that might trip you up later. So never take life. It'd be first thing in yoga and the first thing in Buddhism is ahimsa. Don't take life. And it doesn't mean just don't take human life. In Buddhism is concerned, and Jainism, which are Indian darshanas, you don't take the lives of animals and insects either, not if you can help it. And so that's ahimsa is going to have to be with thought, word, and deed, right? Not harming in thought, in word, or in deed. And you might even say in act, because acts and deeds sometimes are different. There's another subdivision there. So never take life and never engage in stealing. So it's interesting, the first 2 precepts in Buddhism are those 2. What are the first 2 precepts in yoga? These exact 2, ahimsa and asteya. Well, you have to put satyam in there for yoga, but that's truthfulness. That's going to be taken up too. But asteya is non-coveting of other beings' goods and properties, Father of Yoga said, which would be a great teaching to bring into the modern context, wouldn't it, with our contemporary society as Americans. If we wouldn't covet the goods of others, we'd be sharing what we have with others, and they'd be sharing with us, and the karma would be much better, you see. But since that's not, there's so much competition and so much fear and so much ignorance around it, then karmas are being created that don't need to be there. So there's plenty for everyone, just share it and work together to make more. So never engage in stealing is non-coveting of goods in asteya. Never be unchaste. That doesn't mean just sexually, but it means that you can actually betray yourself by your thoughts. You can betray your teacher, you can betray your religion, you can betray your path. That's being unchaste. So people jump right away to the fact that it has something to do with morality. But basically it has a lot to do with your thinking process and how you remain true to the ideals that are given to you by your parents, who are your first gurus. They should be dharmic too, of course. If they're not, then you have a right to to renounce them, Sri Krishna said. If your parents are not giving you the Dharma teachings, you have a right to renounce them. Otherwise, they're your gods. They're your gurus. You have to obey them like they were gods. That's an interesting distinction, because you find out in India that in early times and almost up to current times, that children were very, very much taking care of their father and mother and treating them like gods and obeying. But then this age came where there were problems, you see. The parents were selfish now, and they weren't giving you the Dharma teachings. They weren't learning them themselves. So Sri Krishna said you have a right to renounce them in that case. You have to stay on the Dharmic path. You can come back and save them later, As they say on the airlines, put on your own mask first before helping others. So you need to get this oxygen of the Dharma to your system at all costs. And so you're going to have a right to leave the adharmic behind, so that you can get these teachings and keep them clear, and then go back and help others. That's going to be one of the basic teachings in that level. So never be unchaste to the ideals that are given you, unfaithful to them, and so forth, would be one of the teachings. Never speak falsehoods. So that would be, of course, satyam in yoga, truthfulness. And you would probably put more accent on that if you were a student of Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother, because she would often say that, Sri Ramakrishna would say never speak falsehoods, because the tusks of an elephant should come out, but they should never curve and go back in. That's where you get a rogue elephant, right? He goes mad because the tusks have curved and gone back in, so his words are not right when they come out, so they'll come back in like a tusk of a rogue elephant and cause him to go crazy and do bad things. Negative karmas will be built. So that's what he would teach about untruthfulness. And Holy Mother would add to it and say, no gossiping, no insulting, no talking behind people's backs. That's got to go. No false, criticizing and so forth. So that has to be on a very high level. It's a good teaching, because again, how are you going to get to these higher teachings if you don't understand these basic ones first? So these are all yamas and niyamas of yoga. Did I even put that there? Sorry, Buddhism. I compared you to yoga, but I put here as a subtitle, the yamas and niyamas of Buddhism, so that people who follow yoga would understand that. These two being so close together, that's why we're attracted to Tibetan Buddhism, you see. You can't just stand up and wave a sign, Free Tibet, and put a picture of Buddha in your home and offer a stick of incense once in a while. You have to become a practitioner. And that way you'll go deeper into the whole Buddhist teachings, and you'll free yourself from grounds of birth and death and ignorance. You'll come back again as another Hollywood star, waving a sign. You see, what good is that going to do? It's political only. And Dalai Lama is not that interested in the political, if you talk with him. He's more interested in you getting the Buddha Dharma as a teaching and getting free as a soul, you see, because the political circle is going to go on as long as Maya goes on, or Mara, as he says. You see, Buddhism term Mara really means death in ignorance. So we are coming to the end here of our first half early, because we have to reset, so this would be a good time to break. We'll take up number 5 and go through these other 6 on the exoteric side, and then we'll look at the esoteric side. So pardon us while we take an early break in this 5th class. Come back in a few minutes, 10 or 15 minutes for the second half. Longer second half. Thank you.